The sun was setting over the city of Chicago, casting a warm orange glow across the skyline. The streets were alive with the hum of cars and the chatter of people heading home after a long day. Michelle Carter stood outside the Blue Plate, restaurant known for its elegant ambiance and exquisite food. She had heard about it from a colleague who raved about the place, and tonight she decided to treat herself. It wasn't often that Michelle got a break from her busy schedule as a chief judge, and she wanted to make the most of this rare evening. Michelle stepped inside, the soft chime of the doorbell announcing her arrival. The interior of the restaurant was just as impressive as she'd imagined. Dim lighting, polished wooden floors, and tables adorned with crisp white linens. The faint aroma of herbs and spices wafted through the air, making her stomach rumble in anticipation. She approached the hostess, a young woman with a friendly smile, and gave her name. "Carter," Michelle said softly, her voice carrying a tone of quiet confidence. The hostess checked her clipboard and nodded. "Right this way, ma'am." She led Michelle to a cozy corner table near the window, where the golden hues of the sunset filtered through the glass. It was a perfect spot, private yet inviting. Michelle slid into her seat, feeling a sense of calm wash over her. For once, she wasn't thinking about court cases or legal briefs. Tonight she was simply a woman enjoying a meal. A few moments later, a waiter approached her table. His name tag read, Greg Miller. At first glance, Greg seemed like any other server, tall, with neatly combed hair and a polite smile. But as he drew closer, Michelle noticed something in his eyes. It wasn't warmth or friendliness, it was hesitation. He glanced at her briefly before looking away, as if unsure how to proceed. Michelle pushed the thought aside, assuming it was just a busy night for the staff. "Good evening," Greg said, his tone clipped. He handed her a menu without meeting her gaze. "Can I get you started with something to drink?" Michelle opened the menu, scanning the options. "I'll have a glass of red wine, please. Do you have any recommendations?" Greg hesitated again, his lips curling into what might have been a smirk. "Red wine? Are you sure? Most people like you usually go for something simpler." Michelle froze, her fingers pausing on the page. She looked up at him, her dark eyes locking onto his face. "What do you mean by that?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with curiosity. "Oh, nothing," Greg replied quickly, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Just thought I'd ask." He scribbled her order on his notepad and turned to leave without another word. Michelle frowned, her mind replaying his words. "Most people like you." What exactly did he mean by that? Was it her skin color? Her clothes? Or was she reading too much into it? She shook her head, trying to focus on the menu. Maybe it was just a slip of the tongue, she told herself. Everyone has bad days, even waiters. Still, the comment lingered in the back of her mind, casting a shadow over what was supposed to be a relaxing evening. When Greg returned with her wine, he placed the glass on the table with more force than necessary. A small splash landed on the pristine white tablecloth, but Greg didn't apologize. Instead, he stood there, tapping his pen against his notepad. "So, have you decided what you'd like to eat?" he asked, his tone bordering on impatient. Michelle took a sip of her wine, savoring the rich flavor before responding. "I'm still looking," she said calmly. "Could you tell me which dishes are vegetarian? I don't see many options here." Greg raised an eyebrow, almost mockingly. "Vegetarian, really? You strike me as someone who'd prefer something heartier. Steak, maybe? Or chicken?" Michelle's jaw tightened slightly, but she kept her expression neutral. "I prefer vegetarian." "Meals," she replied firmly. "Could you recommend something?" Greg sighed dramatically, rolling his eyes. "Fine, there's a salad and a pasta dish. That's about it. Anything else you need help deciding on, or can I finally take your order?" The sarcasm in his voice was unmistakable now. Michelle felt a surge of anger rising within her, but she forced herself to stay composed. Losing her temper wouldn't solve anything, especially not here. "I'll have the pasta," she said, closing the menu and handing it back to him. "And, could you bring some bread while I wait?" Greg snatched the menu from her hands and muttered something under his breath as he walked away. Michelle couldn't catch all of it, but she distinctly heard the word difficult. She sat back in her chair, gripping the stem of her wine glass tightly. This wasn't how she envisioned her evening going. As she waited for her food, Michelle observed the other diners around her. Couples laughed over shared plates, friends toasted to celebrations, and families enjoyed each other's company. No one seemed to notice the tension at her table, or perhaps they chose to ignore it. Either way, Michelle felt isolated, as if she were the only one aware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. When Greg finally brought her meal, he set the plate down with a thud, causing the silverware to clatter loudly. He didn't say a word, nor did he check to see if everything was okay. He simply turned and walked away, leaving Michelle to eat in silence. She stared at her plate, her appetite suddenly gone. The pasta looked delicious, but the bitterness of the evening had soured her mood. Despite everything, Michelle tried to focus on the positives. The restaurant was beautiful, the wine was excellent, and she had taken a step toward self-care by coming here. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong. Not because of anything she had done, but because of assumptions others made about her based on appearances. As she finished her meal, Michelle reflected on the irony of the situation. As a judge, she spent her days ensuring fairness and justice for everyone, regardless of race, gender, or background. Yet here she was, sitting in a restaurant where basic respect seemed out of reach. It was a sobering reminder that prejudice still existed, hiding in plain sight behind smiles and polite phrases. When the check arrived, Greg dropped it on the table without ceremony. Michelle pulled out her wallet, paid in cash, and left a generous tip. Not because Greg deserved it, but because she refused to let his behavior dictate her actions. She rose from her seat, smoothing her dress as she prepared to leave. As she passed by the hostess stand, she paused for a moment, considering whether to report Greg's behavior, but then she thought better of it. She would handle this in her own way, on her own terms. Stepping back into the cool night air, Michelle exhaled deeply. The city buzzed around her, oblivious to the weight she carried in her heart. She knew this wasn't the end, it was only the beginning. And as she walked toward her car, she resolved to turn this unpleasant experience into something meaningful. After all, justice wasn't just a concept reserved for courtrooms. Sometimes it started with a single moment of clarity, and tonight, Michelle had found hers. As Michelle stepped out of the blue plate, the cool night air brushed against her face, offering a small sense of relief. But despite the calm surroundings, her mind was far from peaceful. The events of the evening replayed in her head like a broken record. Greg's dismissive tone, his sarcastic remarks, and the way he treated her as if she didn't belong. It all felt wrong. She knew it wasn't just bad service, it was something deeper, something uglier. Prejudice had reared its head in a place where she least expected it. Michelle climbed into her car and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel tightly. She thought about calling someone to talk about what happened. Her sister, maybe, or a close friend, but decided against it. Talking wouldn't change anything. What she needed now was clarity. She started the engine and drove home, the city lights blurring past her window as she mulled over the situation. When she arrived at her apartment, Michelle tossed her keys onto the kitchen counter and sank into her favorite armchair. The soft cushions enveloped her, but they couldn't ease the tension in her chest. She picked up her phone and scrolled through social media absent-mindedly, hoping to distract herself. Instead, she stumbled upon a post about racial discrimination in restaurants. Someone had shared an article detailing similar experiences, people being ignored, insulted, or mistreated because of their race. Reading it made Michelle feel less alone, but it also made her angry. How many others had gone through this? How many had swallowed their pride and walked away just like she did tonight? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Surprised, Michelle glanced at the clock. It was late, and she wasn't expecting anyone. She got up and opened the door cautiously, only to find Ryan Collins standing there. Ryan was a young attorney who had appeared before her court several times. He was sharp, ambitious, and always respectful during hearings. Michelle hadn't seen him outside of work, so his presence caught her off guard. "Ryan?" she said, raising an eyebrow. "What are you doing here?" Ryan smiled sheepishly, holding up a bottle of wine. I know it's unexpected, but I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by. I heard you might need this after your day. His tone was light, but there was sincerity in his eyes. Michelle hesitated for a moment, then stepped aside to let him in. Come on in, she said, closing the door behind him. But I don't think wine is going to fix my mood. Ryan followed her into the living room and took a seat on the couch. That bad, huh? Want to talk about it? Michelle sighed and sat down across from him. For a moment, she debated whether to share her experience, but something about Ryan's genuine concern made her decide to open up. I went to dinner tonight, she began, choosing her words carefully, at the Blue Plate, and let's just say it wasn't the relaxing evening I hoped for. Ryan leaned forward, his expression turning serious. What happened? The waiter was rude, Michelle said simply. Very rude. He made comments that were, well, they weren't okay. About my choices, my preferences, even my ability to afford the food. It was clear he didn't think I belonged there. Ryan frowned, his jaw tightening slightly. That's unacceptable. Did you say something to the manager? Michelle shook her head. No, I didn't want to make a scene. Besides, it's not the first time I've dealt with this kind of thing. You learn to pick your battles. But that doesn't mean you should have to tolerate it, Ryan replied firmly. People like that shouldn't get away with treating others badly, especially not someone like you. Michelle appreciated his support, but she couldn't help feeling frustrated. It's not about me, Ryan. This happens to people every single day. Not everyone has the luxury of walking away or brushing it off. Some people are stuck dealing with it because they can't afford to speak up. Ryan nodded slowly, absorbing her words. You're right. But still, it's not fair. No one deserves to be treated that way. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of the conversation hanging in the air. Finally, Ryan broke the quiet. Do you want me to do anything about it? I could write a review or call the restaurant tomorrow, maybe even file a complaint. Michelle considered his offer, but ultimately declined. Thanks, Ryan, but I'll handle it my own way. Trust me, justice will be served, just not tonight. Ryan raised an eyebrow, intrigued. You sound like you already have a plan. Michelle smiled faintly, though her eyes remained sharp. Let's just say I know how to deal with situations like this. Sometimes patience is the best weapon. The two talked for a little while longer, shifting to lighter topics to ease the tension. Eventually, Ryan stood up to leave. Well, if you ever need backup, you know where to find me, he said with a grin. And I'm serious about that wine. Next time, we're drinking it together. Michelle chuckled softly. Deal. Thanks for stopping by, Ryan. I needed this more than I realized. After Ryan left, Michelle returned to her armchair, her thoughts swirling once again. She knew she couldn't let the incident go unanswered, but she also knew rushing into action wouldn't solve anything. She needed to think carefully, to find the right way to address the problem without losing sight of her principles. Over the next few days, Michelle kept busy with work, diving into case files and court hearings to keep her mind occupied. But no matter how hard she tried, the memory of Greg's behavior lingered in the back of her mind. Every time she passed a restaurant or saw a server assisting customers, she found herself wondering, would they treat her differently based on her appearance? It was a sobering thought, one that reminded her of the invisible barriers society still placed on people of color. Then, one morning, as she reviewed the upcoming cases on her docket, something caught her eye. A lawsuit had been filed against the Blue Plate by a group of former employees, alleging unsafe working conditions and unfair treatment. Among the names listed as key witnesses for the defense was none other than Greg Miller. Michelle stared at the document, her heart skipping a beat. It was almost poetic, the universe giving her a chance to confront the very person who had wronged her. She read through the details of the case, making sure to stay objective. As a judge, she couldn't let personal feelings interfere with her duties. But deep down, she couldn't deny the irony of the situation. Greg would soon stand in her courtroom, unaware that the woman he had insulted was the same person who would oversee his fate. As the trial date approached, Michelle prepared meticulously. She studied every aspect of the case, ensuring she understood both sides of the argument. When the day finally arrived, she entered the courtroom with her usual composure, her robe flowing behind her as she took her seat at the bench. The room fell silent, all eyes on her. Greg was called to testify early in the proceedings. He walked to the witness stand with confidence, seemingly unfazed by the gravity of the situation. Under questioning, he denied any wrongdoing, insisting that he treated all customers equally. But when Michelle leaned forward and addressed him directly, her voice steady and commanding, the atmosphere shifted. "Mr. Miller," she began, her gaze piercing, "you mentioned that you provide equal treatment to everyone, is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Greg replied, nodding emphatically. "Absolutely." Michelle paused for effect, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make him uncomfortable. Then she continued, "Interesting, because I happen to know otherwise. In fact, I experienced your behavior firsthand." Greg's confident demeanor faltered. He blinked rapidly, clearly confused. "I'm sorry, Your Honor, I don't understand." Michelle allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. "Let me refresh your memory. A few weeks ago, I visited the Blue Plate for dinner. You were my server. Do you recall that evening?" Realization dawned on Greg's face and his cheeks flushed red. The courtroom erupted into murmurs as spectators pieced together what was happening. Greg stammered, struggling to form a coherent response. I didn't realize it was you, Your Honor. I swear I didn't mean." "That's quite enough," Michelle interrupted, her tone firm. "Your actions speak louder than your excuses. We'll continue with the trial, but rest assured, justice will prevail." The rest of the hearing proceeded smoothly, with Michelle maintaining her impartiality while subtly reminding everyone present, including Greg, that accountability matters. By the time the trial concluded, Greg's reputation was in tatters. The public exposure of his behavior led to widespread outrage, and the Blue Plate wasted no time distancing itself from him. Within days, Greg was fired. For Michelle, the outcome wasn't just about punishing Greg. It was about sending a message, a reminder that prejudice has consequences, even in places where it seems hidden. As she left the courthouse that evening, she felt a sense of satisfaction, knowing she had turned a painful experience into an opportunity for change. The days following the trial were a whirlwind for Greg Miller. His life, once predictable and routine, had been turned upside down. News of his behavior at the Blue Plate spread like wildfire, fueled by social media posts and angry comments from people who read about the incident. The restaurant issued a public apology, distancing itself from Greg and emphasizing its commitment to equality and customer satisfaction. But for Greg, there was no escaping the backlash. Friends stopped answering his calls, coworkers avoided him, and strangers glared at him when he walked down the street. At first, Greg tried to defend himself. He posted a lengthy statement on his social media accounts, claiming that Michelle had misunderstood his intentions. "I wasn't being racist," he wrote. "I was just having a bad day. Anyone who knows me will tell you I'm not like that." But his words fell flat. People weren't interested in excuses. They wanted accountability. His post was met with ridicule and scorn, forcing him to delete it within hours. With no job and mounting pressure from all sides, Greg sank into despair. He spent most of his time alone in his small apartment, staring at the walls and replaying the trial in his mind. He couldn't shake the image of Michelle Carter sitting behind the bench, her piercing gaze stripping away his defenses. For the first time in his life, Greg felt truly powerless. He had always prided himself on being clever, able to talk his way out of any situation. But this time, there was no loophole, no clever argument that could undo what he had done. Meanwhile, Michelle returned to her daily routine, though the events of the trial stayed with her. She knew she had handled the situation fairly, but she couldn't ignore the lingering unease in her heart. Justice had been served, yes, but it hadn't erased the pain of that night at the restaurant. It reminded her how deeply ingrained prejudice, Could be, lurking beneath polite smiles and casual conversations. And while Greg's downfall might serve as a lesson, she wondered if it would truly change anything, or if it was just another example of punishment without growth. One afternoon, Michelle received an unexpected phone call. It was Ryan Collins, the young attorney who had visited her after the incident at the Blue Plate. "Hey, Judge Carter," Ryan said cheerfully. "How are you holding up?" Michelle smiled faintly. "I'm doing okay, Ryan. How about you?" "I'm good," Ryan replied. "Listen, I wanted to check in because, well, I've been thinking about what happened, about Greg and everything. Have you heard anything about him since the trial?" Michelle hesitated. She hadn't followed Greg's story closely after the trial, choosing instead to focus on her work and personal life. "Not really," she admitted. "Why do you ask?" Ryan sighed. "It's just, I feel bad for the guy, you know? Don't get me wrong, he deserved what happened, but now he's lost his job, his reputation is ruined, and nobody wants anything to do with him. It's like, where does he go from here? Is this really the kind of justice we want?" Michelle leaned back in her chair, considering his words. "Justice isn't supposed to be about revenge, Ryan. It's about fairness, holding people accountable for their actions so they can learn and grow. But whether Greg learns anything from this, and that's up to him." Ryan nodded, even though Michelle couldn't see him. "Yeah, I guess you're right. Still, it makes me wonder. What happens to people like Greg after the dust settles? Do they disappear or do they try to rebuild their lives?" Michelle didn't have an answer. She had seen countless individuals face consequences for their mistakes, but she rarely knew what became of them afterward. Her role as a judge was to ensure fairness in the courtroom, not to track their progress beyond it. "Maybe it's something worth looking into," she said finally. "But for now, I think we've done what we can." After hanging up, Michelle found herself reflecting on Ryan's question. Was justice enough, or did society need to offer a path to redemption for those who stumbled? She thought about Greg sitting alone in his apartment, grappling with shame and regret. Did he deserve a second chance, or was his behavior too toxic to overlook? Over the next few weeks, Michelle threw herself into her advocacy work. She partnered with local organizations to create workshops aimed at promoting inclusivity and respect in workplaces. These sessions focused on recognizing unconscious biases and fostering environments where everyone felt valued. Michelle believed that education was key, helping people understand the impact of their words and actions before situations escalated to the point of legal intervention. During one of these workshops, Michelle shared her own experience at the Blue Plate, though she kept the details vague to protect her privacy. The attendees listened intently, many nodding along as she spoke. Afterward, a young woman approached her, her eyes filled with admiration. "Thank you for sharing your story," she said softly. "It gives me hope that things can change." Michelle smiled warmly. "Change starts with awareness," she replied, "and it continues with action. We all have a role to play in making the world a better place." As the weeks turned into months, Michelle began to notice subtle shifts in the community. More businesses reached out to participate in the workshops, eager to improve their practices. Conversations about diversity and inclusion became more common, replacing the awkward silences that once followed such topics. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was progress, and that gave Michelle hope. Then, one evening, Michelle received a letter in the mail. The envelope was plain, with no return address, and her name was written in shaky handwriting. Curious, she opened it and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The message was brief but heartfelt. "Dear Judge Carter, I don't expect forgiveness, and I know my actions were wrong. I've spent a lot of time thinking about what I did and how it affected you and others. I'm trying to be better, though I know it won't undo the harm I caused. Thank you for showing me that accountability matters. Sincerely, Greg Miller." Michelle stared at the note, her emotions conflicted. Part of her wanted to dismiss it as an empty gesture, a desperate attempt to salvage his reputation. But another Part of her recognized the sincerity in his words. Redemption wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't guaranteed. But Greg had taken the first step toward acknowledging his mistakes, a step that required courage and humility. She set the letter aside and picked up her phone, dialing Ryan's number. When he answered, she said simply, "You were right, Ryan. Sometimes justice isn't just about punishment, it's about giving people a chance to grow." Ryan chuckled softly. "Does this mean you're going to write him back?" Michelle paused, then smiled. "Maybe, but not today. Today I'm just glad to see that change is possible, even for someone like Greg." As she ended the call, Michelle felt a renewed sense of purpose. Justice wasn't a destination, it was a journey. And while the road ahead might be long and uncertain, every step brought them closer to a world where respect and equality weren't just ideals, they were realities. Months had passed since the trial, and life in Chicago moved on as it always did. The city buzzed with its usual energy, cars honking, people rushing to work, and street vendors calling out to passers-by. For Michelle Carter, the incident at the Blue Plate began to feel like a distant memory, though its lessons stayed with her. She continued her advocacy work, speaking at schools, community centers, and businesses about the importance of inclusivity and respect. Her efforts were making a difference, one small step at a time. Greg Miller, on the other hand, was struggling to rebuild his life. After losing his job at the Blue Plate, he found it nearly impossible to secure employment. Every application he submitted seemed to vanish into thin air, and when he did manage to land an interview, the moment employers recognized his name, their enthusiasm quickly faded. It was clear that his reputation preceded him. He spent his days scrolling through job listings, sending emails and rehearsing answers to potential interview questions, but nothing seemed to work. Desperate for income, Greg took odd jobs wherever he could find them, delivering groceries, cleaning offices at night, and even working part-time at a gas station. None of these roles paid well, and they left him feeling drained and unfulfilled. But despite the challenges, Greg refused to give up. He clung to the hope that things would eventually get better, that he could prove himself worthy of a second chance. One evening, as Greg sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, he decided to write another letter. This time, it wasn't addressed to Michelle Carter. Instead, he wrote to the owner of the Blue Plate, explaining how sorry he was for his actions and asking if there might be any possibility of returning to work, not as a server, but in any capacity. He knew it was a long shot, but he had to try. Signing off with a heartfelt apology, he sealed the envelope and dropped it in the mailbox the next morning. To Greg's surprise, he received a response within a week. The owner of the Blue Plate agreed to meet with him, not to offer him a job, but to discuss what had happened and how Greg planned to move forward. When they met at a small cafe near the restaurant, the owner listened carefully as Greg spoke about his journey over the past few months. He admitted his mistakes, expressed genuine remorse, and explained the steps he was taking to educate himself about racism and discrimination. The owner nodded thoughtfully. "I appreciate your honesty, Greg," he said finally. "But rebuilding trust takes time. I can't promise you a position here, but I can recommend you to some contacts who might be willing to give you a chance. Just remember, actions speak louder than words." Greg left the meeting feeling cautiously optimistic. For the first time in months, he felt like someone believed in him, or at least saw potential for change. Over the next few weeks, he followed up on the owner's recommendations, applying for positions at catering companies, food trucks, and even a local bakery. Though rejection remained a constant companion, Greg persisted, determined to show the world that he was more than his past mistakes. Meanwhile, Michelle continued to monitor the ripple effects of her advocacy work. One day, while attending a YI workshop at a downtown hotel, she ran into Ryan Collins again. They greeted each other warmly, catching up over coffee during a break. Ryan mentioned that he'd been following Greg's story online, noting that several news outlets had picked up on his attempts to turn his life around. "People are divided about him," Ryan said, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. "Some think he deserves a second chance, while others say he should face permanent consequences. What do you think?" Greg's efforts to rebuild his life were slow and difficult, but he was beginning to see small signs of progress. After weeks of searching, he finally landed a part-time job at a local bakery. It wasn't glamorous work. He spent most of his time stacking shelves, taking inventory, and helping customers, but it gave him a sense of purpose. For the first time in months, Greg felt like he was contributing something meaningful, even if it was just making someone's morning a little brighter with a fresh loaf of bread. The owner of the bakery, an older woman named Linda, had been reluctant to hire Greg at first. She had read about the incident at the Blue Plate and wasn't sure if giving him a chance was the right decision. But after meeting him in person and hearing his story, she decided to take a risk. "Everyone deserves a second chance," she told him on his first day. "But don't let me down, Greg. This is your opportunity to prove people wrong." Greg took her words to heart. He worked hard, showing up early and staying late whenever he could. He learned the names of regular customers, remembered their favorite pastries, and always greeted them with a smile. Slowly but surely, he began to earn their trust. One customer, an elderly man who came in every Tuesday for a cherry Danish, even complimented Greg one day. "You've got a good attitude, son," the man said. "Keep it up." Those simple words meant more to Greg than he could express. They reminded him that change was possible, even when it felt like the world had turned its back on him. He started volunteering at a community center on weekends, helping organize food drives and mentoring teenagers who were struggling to find direction in life. It wasn't easy. Many of the kids were skeptical of him at first, but Greg's honesty and humility eventually won them over. Back in her role as a judge, Michelle Carter kept tabs on Greg's progress indirectly. She didn't seek out updates or follow news articles about him, but occasionally stories about his efforts would cross her path. Once, during a meeting with a group of lawyers and activists, Ryan Collins mentioned that Greg had become involved in anti-racism workshops, sharing his experiences as a cautionary tale. Michelle listened quietly, her expression thoughtful but unreadable. After the meeting, Ryan approached her. "I know you probably don't want to hear this," he said hesitantly, "but Greg seems different, like he's actually trying to make amends." Michelle nodded slowly. "People can change, Ryan. Whether they do or not depends on how much effort they're willing to put in. From what I've heard, Greg is putting in the work." Ryan raised an eyebrow. "Does that mean you forgive him?" Michelle shook her head. "Forgiveness isn't mine to give. What happened to me that night at the restaurant, it wasn't just about me. It was about all the people who've faced similar treatment and never had a voice. My job isn't to forgive Greg. It's to hold him accountable. If he's truly changed, then accountability has done its job." Ryan nodded, understanding her perspective. Still, he couldn't help feeling a pang of sympathy for Greg. Watching someone try so hard to redeem themselves wasn't easy, especially when the odds were stacked against them. As the months went by, Greg's reputation began to shift. While some people still viewed him with suspicion, others started to see him in a new light. His involvement in community service projects earned him praise from local leaders, and his dedication at the bakery made him a valued employee. Linda even promoted him to assistant manager, citing his strong work ethic and positive attitude. One evening, after closing up the bakery, Greg sat alone in the quiet kitchen, reflecting on how far he'd come. He thought about the mistakes he'd made, the lives he'd hurt, and the countless nights he'd spent wondering if things would ever get better. It hadn't been easy, and there were moments when he doubted himself, but he had persevered. Now, he felt like he was finally starting to make a difference, not just in his own life, but in the lives of others. The next morning, Greg received an unexpected email. It was from Michelle Carter. The subject line read simply, "A second chance." His heart raced as he opened the message. "Dear Greg, I've heard about the work you've been doing in the community, and I wanted to acknowledge your efforts. Change doesn't happen overnight, and it takes courage to face your mistakes head on. Keep going. You're proving that growth is possible. Sincerely, Michelle Carter." Greg stared at the screen, tears welling up in his eyes. He hadn't expected Michelle to reach out, let alone offer words of encouragement. Her message was brief, but it carried immense weight. For the first time since the trial, Greg allowed himself to believe that he might truly be forgiven. Not by everyone, but by the person who mattered most. That afternoon, Greg printed out Michelle's email and pinned it to the bulletin board in his apartment. Beneath it, he wrote a single sentence in bold letters: "Never stop growing." It became his mantra, a reminder of how far he'd come and how much farther he still had to go. Meanwhile, Michelle continued her advocacy work, inspired by the changes she saw around her. She spoke at conferences, wrote articles, and collaborated with organizations dedicated to fighting racism and promoting equality. Her story resonated with people from all walks of life, sparking conversations about accountability, redemption, and the power of second chances. One evening, after delivering a speech at a university, Michelle was approached by a young woman named Elena. "Thank you for sharing your story," Elena said, her voice trembling slightly. "I've been where you were, at the receiving end of prejudice, and it's comforting to know that justice can prevail." Michelle smiled warmly. "Justice isn't perfect, Elena, but it gives us hope. And hope is what keeps us moving forward." Elena nodded, clutching a notebook to her chest. "Do you think people like Greg can really change? Or are they doomed to repeat their mistakes?" Michelle paused, choosing her words carefully. "Change is a choice, Elena. It's not guaranteed, and it's not easy. But when someone is willing to confront their flaws and work toward becoming a better person, we owe it to them and to ourselves to support that journey. That's how we build a better world." As Michelle walked away, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Her fight for justice wasn't just about punishing wrongdoing. It was about creating opportunities for growth and healing. Whether through courtrooms, workshops, or simple acts of kindness, she knew that every step mattered. Greg's transformation wasn't complete, and neither was Michelle's mission. But together, along with countless others striving for a fairer society, they were planting seeds of change. And though the harvest might take years to yield fruit, the process itself was proof that hope endured. It had been nearly a year since the trial, and Michelle Carter decided it was time to revisit the Blue Plate. She hadn't been back since that fateful evening, but she felt ready now. The restaurant had undergone changes in the months following. The incident, new management, revamped training programs for staff, and a renewed focus on inclusivity. Word around town was that the Blue Plate was making strides to ensure no one else would experience what Michelle had gone through. On a crisp autumn evening, Michelle stepped inside the restaurant once again. The interior looked much the same, with its warm lighting and elegant decor, but there was a noticeable difference in the atmosphere. The hostess greeted her warmly, leading her to a table by the window where golden leaves fluttered outside. Michelle took her seat, feeling a mix of curiosity and cautious optimism. Her server arrived shortly after, a young man named Ethan who introduced himself with a friendly smile. He handed her the menu without hesitation, treating her with the kind of respect every customer deserved. Michelle glanced at him briefly, noting his professionalism. "I'll have the vegetarian pasta," she said, closing the menu. "And a glass of red wine, please." "Great choice," Ethan replied cheerfully before heading off to place her order. Michelle watched him go, reflecting on how different this experience felt compared to her last visit. There was no trace of awkwardness or discomfort, just a sense of normalcy. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to relax. As she waited for her meal, Michelle observed the other diners around her. Couples laughed over shared plates, families enjoyed hearty meals together, and solo patrons sipped coffee while reading books. It was a scene of harmony, a stark contrast to the tension she'd encountered during her previous visit. She couldn't help but feel proud of the role she'd played, indirectly, in helping bring about this change. When her food arrived, it was presented beautifully, garnished with fresh herbs and served piping hot. Michelle took a bite, savoring the rich flavors. It tasted better than she remembered, perhaps because she could fully enjoy it this time without the weight of prejudice overshadowing her experience. As she ate, Ethan checked in periodically, ensuring everything was to her liking. His attentiveness reminded her of the importance of treating others with dignity and care. After finishing her meal, Michelle asked to speak with the manager. A woman named Lisa approached her table, her demeanor polite yet professional. "How was everything tonight?" Lisa asked, her tone warm. "It was wonderful," Michelle replied sincerely. "Thank you for asking. I wanted to commend you and your team for the excellent service. You've clearly made significant improvements since my last visit." Lisa's smile faltered slightly, and Michelle noticed a flicker of recognition in her eyes. "Are you Judge Carter?" she asked hesitantly. Michelle nodded. "Yes, I am, and I want you to know that I appreciate the effort you've put into creating a welcoming environment here. It makes a difference, not just for me, but for everyone who walks through those doors." Lisa's expression softened, gratitude evident on her face. "We've worked hard to learn from past mistakes," she admitted. "Your story inspired us to do better. We still have a long way to go, but we're committed to making sure every guest feels valued." Michelle smiled, touched by her words. "That's all anyone can ask for, an honest effort to improve. Keep going, Lisa. You're doing important work." As Michelle prepared to leave, she paused near the entrance, taking one last look at the bustling dining room. The restaurant wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was a testament to the power of accountability and growth. People could change, places could evolve, and justice didn't always have to mean punishment. Sometimes, it meant giving someone the tools and motivation to become better. Outside, the cool night air greeted her as she stepped onto the sidewalk. The city buzzed around her, alive with energy and possibility. Michelle walked slowly, letting the sounds of laughter and music wash over her. She thought about Greg and how far he'd come since their paths crossed. Though they hadn't spoken directly since his email, she hoped he continued to grow, finding purpose in his efforts to make amends. A few blocks away, Greg was wrapping up his shift at the bakery. He locked the door behind him and pulled his jacket tighter against the chill. As he walked home, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. He wasn't the same person he'd been a year ago. The arrogance and ignorance that once defined him were fading, replaced by humility and a desire to contribute positively to the world. Greg stopped at a park along the way, sitting on a bench, beneath a street lamp. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through recent messages, pausing on Michelle's email. Reading it again filled him with a sense of determination. He knew he couldn't undo the harm he'd caused, but he could continue working to ensure he never repeated those mistakes. The next morning, Greg volunteered at the community center, helping organize a workshop on racial sensitivity. He stood at the front of the room, sharing his story with a group of teenagers. "I messed up big time," he admitted, his voice steady. "But I'm trying to fix it. If I can change, so can you. It's not easy, but it's worth it." The teens listened intently, some nodding in agreement. One girl raised her hand. "Do you think people will ever trust you again?" Greg thought for a moment before answering. "Some might and some won't. But trust isn't something you demand. It's something you earn. All I can do is keep showing up, keep doing the right thing, and hope that eventually people see the real me." Back at her apartment, Michelle sat by the window, gazing out at the city skyline. She thought about the interconnectedness of it all, how one person's actions could ripple outward, affecting countless lives. Justice wasn't just about courtrooms and verdicts. It was about fostering understanding, encouraging growth, and building bridges where walls once stood. She picked up a pen and began writing in her journal, capturing her thoughts on the past year. Each word was a reminder of how far she and others had come. Though challenges remained, she felt hopeful. Change was happening, however slowly, and she was grateful to be part of it. In the end, Michelle realized that justice wasn't a destination. It was a process. It required patience, perseverance, and faith in humanity's ability to grow. And as she closed her journal and turned off the light, She knew that tomorrow held endless possibilities for healing, learning, and moving forward.